So we have our guests online. Yes, I think I see everyone. Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. And thank you so much for joining us today. We're pleased to have two guests from DESA to launch the World Economic Situation and Prospects Report 2022. As you know, this is one of our flagship reports. So today we're extremely pleased to be joined by Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, Mr. Liu Zhenmin, and also by Hamid Rashid, the lead author of the report and also the chief of the Global Economic Monitoring Branch and Economic Analysis and Policy Division at DESA. So without further ado, I will give them the floor to introduce the report. Mr. Zhenmin, yeah, go ahead. Let's see if we can see you on the screen here.
You can see me, you can watch me.
I can see you on the small, now I can see you on the big screen. Excellent, please go ahead and welcome.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all colleagues. Distinguished guests, dear friends of the press, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to join you today for the launch of the World Economic Situation and Prospect 2022, or the acronym WESP 2022. Dear colleagues, the WESP 2022 is a collective and a joint research project coordinated and led by my department, UNCTAD, but joined with a number of UN system entities and agencies. I wish to acknowledge the joint efforts of colleagues from across the UN system, DESA, UNCTAD, and 5 regional economic commissions, including ECLAC, ESCAP, ESCOA, ECA, and ECE, and contributions from the UNOHRLS and the World Tourism Organization for producing this important report. Dear colleagues, while we are launching this report, WESP 2022, we are still living in a time of great uncertainty, facing significantly bleak possibilities. Even as we mark nearly 2 full years since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, it continues its dreadful impact. After a deadly global economic contraction in 2020, last year, 2021, was marked by a global economic recovery, although it remains uneven and fragile. Significant progress in vaccinations, along with supportive macroeconomic policies in a number of countries, made this possible, with several economic activities returning to pre-crisis levels. But a full global recovery is still a long way off. More than a fifth of the developing countries are yet to achieve their pre-pandemic levels of output. Indeed, they are hampered by insufficient access to vaccines and limited financial resources. Dear colleagues, as we enter the year 2022, the global economic picture is still murky. Job creation has not yet made up for the earliest losses. With the employment deficits disproportionately affecting women and the youth. At the same time, the spread of the new COVID-19 variants, supply shortages, rapidly rising inflation in many parts of the world, and the looming debt challenges are clouding the economic outlook. All these factors threaten to slow the pace or even reverse the hard-won achievements of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Dear colleagues, during the past 2 years, the number of people living in extreme poverty has increased sharply. Gender gaps have widened, and income and wealth inequalities within and between countries have gone up. We are witnessing an increase in severe and frequent shocks due to the changing climate. Governments around the world now face difficult policy choices to turn the rebound in output to a more robust, inclusive, and sustainable recovery. This will require better targeted and coordinated monetary and fiscal policies to avoid disorderly adjustments while balancing inflation, debt distress, and needed investments to achieve the 2030 Agenda and climate action. Effective labor market and human development policies can complement these to speed up job creation, invest in skills, and expand social protection. Dear friends, we must avoid long-lasting scars. The international community must step up efforts to strengthen and reinvigorate multilateralism in all aspects. In doing so, we must ensure universal access to vaccines, address debt challenges, ease trade tensions, and reduce carbon emissions. We are at a critical juncture in human history today. The decisions we make and actions we take today will profoundly affect future generations and shape our common destiny. So let us turn this crisis into opportunity to steer the world in the right direction and secure a sustainable future for all. Now I have the honor to invite the lead author of the WESP 2022, my colleague, Mr. Hamid Rashid, to share with you more details of the report, the WESP 2022. Hamid, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Liu.
Mr. Rashid, you have the floor. Give it maybe a second so we can put you on the big screen. And I believe you will also use a PowerPoint presentation, right?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you, Liu, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, colleagues. And I will now present some of the key findings of our report. And let me turn on my PowerPoint. Just to start the conversation, the world economy is certainly in a very difficult spot. And the road ahead is bumpy, if not, what I would say, perilous. We have significant challenges. 2021 ended up being a year. Can you see my PowerPoint?
And it's on the big screen.
Okay.
It's perfect.
Yes, thank you. So what happened in 2021, we had some rebound in the global economy, mostly because of a pent-up demand from households were released. Consumer spending went up significantly, investment picked up as well. And that pushed the global growth to a sort of unprecedented 5.5% in 2021. But that is glass half full, or rather half empty, I would say, because it was mostly catching up of the lost growth in 2020 when the global economy contracted by 3.4%. So what we see ahead of us are four mutually reinforcing and interconnected challenges or headwinds. One is, of course, the spread of the new variant of the virus that has again disrupted many of the economic activities, either through some kind of new introduction of restrictions or through self-isolation and other kind of disruptions that we are seeing. Second is, of course, the lingering labor market disruptions. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then supply chain challenges as well that has been lingering. And finally, we are seeing rising inflationary pressures, both in developed economies and developing countries. And these are the significant headwinds that we cannot ignore. And that is, to some extent, holding back a full recovery of the global economy. So we project the global economy would, the growth would moderate to about 4% in 2022, and even slow down further to 3.5% in 2023. But again, the word of caution here is that our projection is contingent on several assumptions. One assumption is that the vaccination progress that we have been making will continue. There'll be no major disruptions or pandemic-related disruptions again in the near term, in the next few quarters. And of course, there'll be no major surprises with the monetary policy stances that we have in the advanced economies. And with that, we would expect the world economy to recover or continue the recovery in 2022. But what is worrying some, we have to look beyond the GDP numbers and the growth numbers. One impact that we have to take into account is that the rising poverty and inequality, both in developed countries, but mostly in developing countries. It is still worrisome for us that 64 more million people will be living in extreme poverty in 2022 relative to 2019. And if I can show it, we saw a gradual decline in poverty rate, in extreme poverty, since the beginning of this decade. And it was a decline to 812 million people in 2019. And there's a steep increase in global poverty, extreme poverty in 2020. And we're yet to come back to 2019 levels. And so far, the gap is still 64 million people. More people are living in extreme poverty. And that is something is quite worrisome. Second impact is also rising inequality. And I think our report covers a lot about this trend, especially the disproportionate effect of the crisis on the poor households. If you see the bottom 40%, their income fell by 6.57% in 2021 compared to 2019 numbers. But the income of the top 40% declined by a smaller magnitude, by only about 2.8%. And underpinning this uneven recovery is the uneven access to vaccination and treatment. And also, because of this uneven pace of recovery, we'll see widening gap between developed and developing countries, both in terms of total output, also in terms of GDP per capita. So before the crisis, we were seeing globally a convergence or the reduction of gaps between the per capita income of the poor and the rich countries. But that trend has reversed since the crisis. If you look at this graph, we see that the crisis, right after the crisis in 2021, almost all group of countries, three groups of countries that we look at, all of them had a similar shock in terms of the reduction in GDP per capita. But the developed countries are recovering very, very quickly. By 2023, almost all developing countries are back to their pre-pandemic level of GDP per capita that we projected before the pandemic. But the developing countries are still, there's a huge gap, about 2.4% contraction in GDP per capita relative to what we projected before the pandemic. And that gap is widening, and that gap has persisted. And also among the countries, about a fifth of the developing countries, their total output will be below 2019 levels in 2023. And our estimates show that about 59 developing countries, and including 22 LDCs, they'll see their income, average income per capita would be about 11% lower than compared to the developed country counterparts in 2023. So that widening gap is worrisome for international development and international trends that we see. And here, the story, underlying story that explains this uneven pace of recovery is the uneven access to vaccines and vaccination and treatment. After all the efforts that we made, the least developed countries, we have about only 25 doses per 100 people compared to 150 doses per 100 people in the advanced economies, the developed economies. And that disparity is persisting, and it is worrisome for us. And we need to reduce that gap so that we can ensure universal access to vaccination for all people, especially in developing countries. Otherwise, we'll not be able to beat the pandemic, because it will be moving from developed countries to developing countries and coming back, and then come back to the developed countries. So we need to have a global approach to make sure that we are fighting the pandemic everywhere with the same level of intensity and same level of efforts in vaccination. So one of the lasting impacts are through the labor market effects. And as I said in the initial slide, that we see significant disruptions in the labor market. We have 137 million fewer jobs today relative to the pre-pandemic level. This is a large number globally, but what is important for us to take into account that the story is uneven. In the developed countries, the story is that there are shortage of workers. In the developing countries, we are seeing shortage of jobs. So this is again a tale of two cities, two different trends we are observing, and that has to be addressed with stronger policy support going forward. And labor market outcomes are affecting both in poverty, extreme poverty, and food security. And we are seeing that a number of countries that food scarcity amid rising inflation is a major concern. Some of the developing countries are doing better than others, especially commodity exporters, with some pickup in commodity prices. But on the other hand, some of the tourism-dependent countries are still hurting very much because tourism hasn't picked up as yet, and unless we have significant success in vaccination and containment of the pandemic. So the policy challenge that the landscape that we are looking at is extremely challenging and requires significant reconsideration, and we have to look at how we can ultimately beat the pandemic and come out with a full recovery, robust and inclusive recovery. So one, of course, challenge would remain that we have to maintain the accommodative fiscal policy, despite the capacity to maintain that accommodative fiscal policies is varying among countries, especially developing countries. They have significant challenges. Fiscal space are limited for many countries. And on top of that, many of them are facing very high levels of debt, and rising cost of public debt is putting a lot of challenges for them. We have to strengthen international cooperation for the low and middle income countries, especially in terms of debt relief and debt restructuring. And we have to pursue policies that can prioritize job creation as opposed to just GDP growth. And social protection needs to play a very important role to make sure most disadvantaged groups, especially women and youth, who can come back to the job market with adequate social protection and support from public policy. Many developing countries are facing significant debt distress, and they were actually building up a lot of debt even before the crisis. Ultra low interest rates during the past decade, before 2019, encouraged many developing countries to borrow extensively, especially in the international capital market. Public external debt of these countries increased, almost doubled in 10 years, compared to 7% decline in public external debt during the previous decade before the global financial crisis. On top of that, most of this debt is owed to the private creditors, which have additional challenges for many of these countries. That the debt owed to the private creditors increased by 264% before the crisis in the 10-year period. So we have a situation where many of the developing countries need significant fiscal support, but they cannot do it because of this debt overhang and debt burden that they're facing. And that's where the international cooperation must play a very important role to provide meaningful debt restructuring and debt relief to stimulate the recovery and to sustain the recovery going forward in the near term. The last two slides that I would show is about what the responses to the crisis on the monetary side, which has been extremely robust and timely. We see that central banks quickly around the world, they took up the challenge and they rose to the occasion. The major developed country central banks, they expanded their balance sheets by about $10 trillion in a very, very short period of time. And if you look at the slide, and that really helped calm the financial markets, stabilize the financial market, restore market confidence, and to some extent provide a short-term impetus to growth, because it was a mechanism to allow governments in developed countries to sustain their expansionary fiscal policy stances. And also developing countries also followed suit this time. 27 developing countries also implemented what is known as asset purchase programs to stimulate and to support the fiscal side. But while these actions have had significant effects in stabilizing market conditions, but they had muted effects on economic growth, especially as we go longer in the horizon. We don't see much benefit coming out of this stimulus, monetary stimulus that came from the central banks. And more worryingly, we see that the asset purchase programs actually inflated asset prices significantly, and which benefited the wealthy households relative to the poorer households didn't receive that much benefit. In the US, for example, top 1% wealth gain was average about 3.5 million per person. But the bottom 20%, the wealth gain average about only 5,300 per person. So a huge disparity in gains in terms of, because the wealthy households hold more financial assets, so they benefited more when the asset prices went up. But the poor households don't have financial assets, they don't have stocks, they don't invest in bonds. And that is where, and this story is across the board in other developed countries as well, in Europe and also in other countries. And in some of the developing countries, we're seeing the similar trend. And this is the chart. You see the asset prices of NASDAQ and other S&P. They skyrocketed during the pandemic, defying almost gravity. And I would expect this is counterintuitive because we're in the middle of a crisis, but the financial market did much better than the real economy. And this is a significant challenge for the policymakers going forward. So the road ahead is bumpy, as I said at the outset, and bumpy partly because the monetary policy expansion that we saw in the last almost 2 years, that has had some positive effects, but now we're approaching a time when monetary policy normalization would become inevitable. But this is, again, at a time when we are also seeing pressures on the fiscal side to remain accommodative. So what is the question for us is that whether there can be a soft landing. And the soft landing would be probably the $1 trillion question for the world economy. There are significant risks for policy mistakes going forward. And especially if there's unanticipated adjustments in monetary policy stances in developed countries, it can actually affect the debt sustainability of the developing countries. If there's a sudden spike in interest rates, we'll see massive outflow of capital from developing countries, and the cost of capital would go up for developing countries. That may make their debt highly unsustainable, especially for countries that are already facing significant debt distress. And then what needs to happen is that we need better coordination, not only fiscal side and international support on the fiscal side, but also on the monetary side as well, to make sure that the world economy is able to minimize the spillover effects, especially on developing countries. There needs to be careful communication. The policy changes all the major central banks that are anticipating that in 2022, that needs to be carefully communicated, calibrated, and with sufficient early warning for the developing countries so that they can also adjust their monetary policy stances to minimize the disruptive effect of sudden shifts in monetary condition and monetary tightening. There could be a significant use of macroprudential policies going forward to make sure the APPs support some of the more important social objectives, including addressing inequality issues, including addressing climate change and climate action. And there, the greening of APPs can be important because we don't expect central banks would offload the assets that they're holding right now in the course of next 1 or 2 years. So there'll be a lot of opportunities for central banks to readjust their portfolios, balance sheets, and to support more greening of the central bank interventions. And finally, would need to see major reforms in fiscal and taxation policies in developed countries to make sure that there are some stabilizing effects and we don't see even debt distress or debt crisis in advanced economies, which could have very significant spillover effects on the developing countries. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you. Let us now turn to the room for questions. Yes, please go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Introduce yourself and tell us who your question is addressed to.
Yes, to this gentleman. First of all, where can we get, Evelyn Leopold, first of all, where can we get a copy of what, you have this?
It's online. I don't have the full printout, but it's online on DESA's website.
Where is it?
Maybe you do have the exact...
The WESP report.
Yeah, but I mean,
Yeah.
you have the hard copy back here?
No, I don't have hard copies, unfortunately, but it's...
Because it's
online.
easier reading it in hard copy. That was an excellent presentation just now. All right, the question is on income inequality. Is this in every country in the world, all over, or is it in a particular region? The trend seems to be getting worse from what you said. Is that correct?
Thank you for the question. I think inequality, if it's directed to me, if I may answer, inequality is rising across the board. In some of the countries, we're seeing a sharper increases in inequality. In others, and not so sudden increases. But overall, we are seeing that what we can say, if I can borrow a proverb, is that rising tide of recovery doesn't lift all boats. Some are being lifted out of this crisis fairly quickly through massive improvements in their asset holdings, whether it's real estate or financial assets, but others are falling behind. So if you ask me whether every country, of course, we cannot say inequality is rising in every country, but in majority of the countries, we're seeing a sharp increases in inequality. And that is concerning from the UN point of view, because we want lower inequality within countries and also between countries, because we see rising inequality can be very disruptive for social and political cohesion. So this is a trend, and that is continuing. It has been continuing before the crisis, but it worsened since the since the pandemic hit the global economy. Thank you.
Okay, Evelyn, you have a follow-up.
I also wanted to welcome you on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association. Thank you for the briefing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Ahmed Fathi of ATN News. Let me start at the outset with a quote from Undersecretary General Zhenmin. We live in a time of great uncertainty. Dr. Rashid, speaking about monetary policy at countries, and I see you characterize it that it have rose to the occasion or to the situation. How does the increase of interest rate in the developed countries gonna impact the direct foreign investments in the developed countries? How is the monetary policy, while at one phase it might show some progress, even cosmetically, but the bottom line that the developed countries are still under the trenches with regard to this point. If you can highlight on this part. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Actually, it's a very relevant question for the global economy. Money flows, money chases return, and return is, money chases risk-adjusted return. When the 10 years since the global financial crisis in 2008-9, we had ultra-low interest rates in advanced economies, and that's when we saw massive shifts in flows Unfortunately, most of the flows were portfolio flows, but still we saw a lot of money going into developing countries where there was higher return, even when you adjust for the risks, perceived risks that many of these developing countries faced. So now with rising interest rates in developed economies, we see a reverse flow. It's most likely that many of the flows that went in, whether it's FDI or portfolio flows, FDI flows would be affected because risk-adjusted return in advanced economies might be higher than it was before, or it was during the low interest rate period. So we'd see a major reallocation of global capital going forward. And that is concerning because if it happens too quickly, we may have what we experienced, taper tantrum, when the QE after the global financial crisis was tapering. And that's when we saw market malfunction. So I think this is where we want to prepare the developing countries to remain prepared for this kind of eventualities. One tool that they can use is macroprudential tools to make sure that there's no abrupt outflows. They can also use some capital account management techniques, if necessary, again, to stabilize outflows. So I think we would see some disruptions, but it can be managed better if countries are getting the early warning. And the Fed, U.S. Central Bank, has provided some early warning that it will raise interest rates at least 3 times during 2022. But other central banks are yet to make that kind of announcement, and ECB will probably hold on to their rates for 2022 for most part, unless there's a further spike in inflation. So inflationary pressures in developed countries are definitely real, and that would require central banks to intervene and raise interest rates. But that can be destabilizing for many of the developing countries that has been used to very low-cost funds from the advanced economies flowing into their countries.
A follow-up, please. Speaking on interest rates and low interest rates, do you foresee that we are on the verge of having a new quantitative easing policy stage, and taking into consideration that the inflation now is nowhere where it was almost non-existent back in 2008, 2009? What is the prospects for another quantitative easing wave of policies?
Yeah, I think that to be very, what I described as the APP is a form of quantitative easing. Asset purchase program is quantitative easing. The scope has been broadened because when the QE was first introduced, actually a QE goes back to Japan in the 90s. But when the Fed adopted QE after the global financial crisis, it was basically to shore up what is known as toxic assets. So it basically bought up many of the toxic assets that nobody wanted to buy, with the objective of reducing long-term rates and hoping that if long-term rates become low, that will stimulate bank credit and ultimately investment, and that will stimulate growth. But that has not been proven right. That assumption hasn't held true. So to answer your question, we don't foresee a massive increases in QE/APP, because what we can expect is that no major unwinding in the short term. Fed has already announced tapering, some degree of tapering by $15 billion reduction in monthly purchases. But beyond that, I don't think they would make the purchases zero in the near term. So they might reduce it further, how much assets they purchase from the market. But overall, we don't expect that this will unwind too quickly, because that could be disruptive even for the domestic economy of the US as well.
Thank you. Let me now turn to the screen. We have a question from Ibtisam.
Thank you. My name is Ibtisam Azim from Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. So my question is you talked in the report about how women, especially poor women, are suffering more than any other groups, and also that the support of unpaid domestic work, including childcare, will remain critical in helping women to re-enter the labor force. Could you please elaborate on that? And is there any examples in countries who are doing so? And then I semantic question on something. You talk in the report, you said also women, especially in developing countries, experience a sharper decline in employment as a result of pandemic. My question is just technical. Why not saying a higher unemployment? Is there a difference between the two things, or just the UN language? Thank you.
No, I don't think there's any hidden meaning behind what we wrote there. It is basically, yeah, they definitely experience sharper increases in unemployment, but unemployment is slightly difficult to attribute to, because many of them were unable to, because unemployment has a very technical definition. You were actively looking for work and you couldn't find work. That is unemployment. Period varies by country. Some countries, 6 months, you're actively looking for a job and you didn't get a job, and then you're unemployed. After 6 months, you are out of the labor force. But overall, the women basically were not able to participate in the labor market because of challenges that we mentioned, unpaid childcare and the challenges, to take care of family members during the pandemic. But coming back to your question, the major issue for women in many developing countries has been that they were at the forefront of the pandemic, either as health workers or in other contact-intensive sectors. Many of the countries didn't even have PPPs. Many of the countries didn't have other kind of ways of protecting these sectors that were highly contact-intensive. So they were at the forefront. They're at the front of our fight against the pandemic. And the risk mitigation measures were not adequate to keep them in the labor force. Many of them had to opt out. Many of them could not. So in our previous report, we talked about even women entrepreneurs in developing countries face significant challenges because they didn't get sufficient support from the government in terms of, so there are some structural inequalities, gender inequalities that cannot be ignored anymore, because when a pandemic hits, the weakest suffers the most. And in this case, women and youth often suffered the most because they had lower skills. Often they had higher barriers to entry in the job market. They had other expectations from the family side. So all of this played a very critical role in terms of women's participation during the pandemic, but also during the post-pandemic period. And we cannot say we are in the post-pandemic phase as yet. In some countries, we see some retreat of the pandemic, but still the support from the social side would be extremely important to make sure the women can come back to the workforce. And to answer your question, I don't want to specify any country, but many countries in Europe have done better in terms of providing support to women with children. I think in the US also child credit played a very important role, but it expired. So child tax credit and some direct payment to households, because childcare cost is real, and most of the women who are at the bottom of the skill sets, they have their wages are not high enough to pay for childcare. So if you do a simple cost benefit, if a person has to pay $5 for childcare and earns $6 in the labor market, there's no point for the person to participate in the job market. So and that is a structural challenge that we have to keep in mind. I think this crisis, as Mr. Liu mentioned, presents an opportunity to rethink and redesign social protection policies. It cannot be one size fits all. We have to have a very differentiated and targeted social protection policies and labor market policies to make sure that we're able to protect the most vulnerable in the labor market. Those in the financial sector, those who are in the tech sectors, they were not affected by the crisis because they have the privilege of working remotely. We often have the privilege of working remotely, but many of the frontline workers didn't have that privilege. So we have to, when you think about pandemic planning going forward, we have to make sure that we target those people better. At this time, we were unprepared. It came as a surprise, but this is an opportunity for us to build back better and make sure that women are protected, the youth are protected, children are protected. In the report, we talk about learning inequality, and that has been also very severe, especially in poorer countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there more questions in the room? Yeah, Dulcie, please go ahead.
Thanks very much. I was just curious, you mentioned that Europe, some European countries have done made some progress in terms of getting the social needs of women, providing those needs so they can go back to work. So in the last year, where would you say which region has actually sort of bucked these negative trends that persist? Who's providing the best example of how to deal with this pandemic and get rid of inequalities? Thanks.
This is a very difficult question. Actually, we haven't seen any silver bullet in any country that did extremely well in terms of combating the pandemic. In some cases, we have seen significant success in terms of taming the virus. But in other cases, we have seen quite a bit of success in terms of bringing back workers to the workforce. In Denmark and other places, some of the support to businesses definitely played a very important role to make sure instead of providing direct cash transfers to the households, there was support given to the businesses and it was contingent on that they don't fire the employees. So I think much of it depended on initial condition before entering the pandemic. Traditionally, we all know social protection frameworks in the Scandinavian countries or countries in Northern Europe have been generally more robust compared to places in other parts of the world. And they did better, at least in terms of job retention and women's participation in the workforce, better relative to countries that didn't have that kind of protective measures in place. So again, this is not a broad stroke answer to your question, but what we would expect from the policy side, from a macroeconomic policy side, is that we need to have better sort of connection between macro policy interventions and labor market policies, because when a pandemic hits, it is not just a macroeconomic issue. It's a health issue, it's a social protection issue, it's a labor market issue, and we need to address all of this in a more concerted and cohesive manner. I think this is the lesson that we can take from the pandemic. And I would say the countries with better initial conditions did better in terms of at least minimizing the labor market impact, minimizing the impact on inequality and re-entering the workforces, labor market.
Thank you. Let me just take now two final questions. And if you don't mind, I will take the two questions one after the other, and maybe you and Mr. Liu can address them together, and we will conclude. So please go ahead.
Yeah, this is Arun Lewis from IANS. You revised upward the estimates for India for last year by 1.7%, and again the projection for this year by about 6.6%. Could you please tell us what is the factor behind the upward revisions?
Okay, and let me take.
We have revised.
Let me just take one final question from the screen, and then we can take them together. Yoshita, if you still have a question, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. My question is that in the report, it's mentioned that the deadly wave of infection of the Delta variant killed 240,000 people in India between April and June and disrupted economic recovery. And similar episodes could take place in the near term. That's what the report says. Can you elaborate on that a little bit, please, in the sense of, given that the vaccination has picked up in India, but what kind of an impact are we looking at? Thank you.
I think we are, if I'll take the second question first, I think we're seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. This is the evolution of any pandemic, and I'm not a public health specialist, but I can, whatever I have read is that as the virus mutates, we see new and new variants, and they become more transmissible but less virulent. And this is what we are seeing with Omicron right now. Omicron spread very, very quickly, again, caught us by surprise in many countries. But we see that the effects in terms of mortality, in terms of overall impact on the health system is still very muted compared to what we saw with Delta. So what we are expecting that we are transitioning from endemic to pandemic to endemic. If that is our baseline scenario, that what I suggested in the beginning, that we expect no more surprises with the pandemic, meaning that we won't expect another major variant coming out, which is as deadly as the Delta variant. If that holds true, that probably we are inching towards the end of the pandemic and beginning of the endemic. meaning that we would have flu-like episodes every year, which is considered a COVID-related flu, which should be a good sign. But our report is not a public health report. Our report is a macroeconomic report. What we're trying to say is that even if we beat the pandemic, we have to beat the side effects of the pandemic that has been brought forward. Rising poverty, rising inequality, slack in the labor market. We'll have to address those issues up front. Otherwise, what would happen is that we'll see a divergent recovery between developed and developing countries and between the rich and poor in both developed and developing countries. Rich would recover, poor would not recover. So world as a whole will be more vulnerable if we don't have an inclusive and sustainable recovery going forward. So again, the Delta variant affected some of the countries, including India, extremely severely, and that is a sort of a red flag and a warning. But we are hoping that we are past the Delta variant and we won't see that kind of resurgence of a very virulent virus going forward in any country. But again, touch wood, we can't, again, I'm not a public health specialist. I cannot guarantee what would happen with the virus, but public health experts are being more optimistic now, given the data that we have for the last 6 weeks on the Omicron. I think this trend is holding true. It held true in South Africa. We saw a very sudden spike and then a sudden decline. And we're seeing the same thing in the northeast of the US right now. So hopefully this is the end of the pandemic phase and entering. But our message of the report is that beating the pandemic, as difficult as it was, let's not underestimate the challenges ahead, which are more macroeconomic challenges that we have to keep in mind. About the specific numbers about growth adjustments, I think I would suggest that we have a bilateral discussion, because I would also want to bring in my team who are involved in the adjusting or downward adjustments of the forecast numbers for countries, specific countries.
Good.
We can have just a quick discussion right after this presentation.
We can arrange that, that's for sure. Mr. Liu, can I give you the final word?
Thank you. I think I want to thank all colleagues for their great interest in joining this launch of the WESP 2022. For the United Nations, for the Secretary General Antonio Guterres, what we expect for 2022, a continued robust, inclusive, and sustainable recovery. But to be honest, no single measure of one area would be able to maintain and support such a global recovery. We need to take the multidimensional measures by all governments. And we need to continue to support multilateralism. First, I think we need to connect the global recovery with the global achievement of vaccination of 70% of the population in each of the countries by mid-2022. So this would minimum, this will really lay the good foundation for achieving the recovery. Second, we need to avoid any debt crisis in some of the countries, so that there would be no global financial turmoil. I think that would be very critical. We need to continue to address the debt issue. Third, we need to continue to build up the support of the financing for development in support of global recovery. Because I think financing for development should go to investment. Only for investment in projects, in manufacturing, in agriculture, then job opportunities will be created for all people. That's why I think all these measures should be connected. Of course, we also need to address many of the issues, poverty, inequality. Of course, all this must be addressed from a more positive perspective. We need to create jobs. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. So the report is now online. It was sent by email to all of you under embargo yesterday. And for our part, well, thank you for joining us today. We will be back tomorrow for the noon briefing. And thank you so much.
Thank you.